the Royal Navy has access to air research establishments. The US Navy has none because it's not occurred to them that there could be any improvement on the aircraft and the aircraft carriers they have. They are perfect. We are perfect. There is nobody else in the world but us. We don't need to think about change. Nobody needs to change when they're perfect. And then suddenly the British come along and say, actually, there are two things that we've been playing with, which you might be interested in.
Hello. On the afternoon of the 31st of May 1916, the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet sighted ships of the Imperial German Navy's High Seas Fleet, and so began the major significant sea battle of the First World War. The result was inconclusive, but what were the real consequences? Naval historian N.A.M. Rodger joins to discuss this and other subjects as we cover the naval history of Britain in the 20th century. This is the second of a two-part special, so if you haven't heard episode 1, there's a link in the show notes. Now, I should warn you, we do mention briefly the famine in Ireland and the Navy's role in it to begin with. And we end with a brief chat on Admiral Nelson and the future of naval combat, so there's plenty of ground covered today. Coming up on Saturday, William Boyd joins to discuss his latest novel. We have the Mafia and the Kennedys, and plenty more to come. So please do subscribe and follow, and if you can give a kind review, I'd be most grateful. But in the meantime, I'll hand you over to A Naval History of Britain, The Rise, with N.A.M. Rodger, as we dive into the famine in Ireland before continuing with the First World War. That immediately makes me think of Ireland, which of course ended up relying on imports which would have been shipped in. What's the role of, all the navies, merchant as well, in the famine, given it was ultimately down to a failed government policy?
Well, this is, of course, we've stepped rapidly back to the 1840s here.
Yes.
40s.
Just briefly, well, because I know we've been going chronologically. Sorry for making.
Well, no, that doesn't matter. That's it's a good question. It's a period when a particularly ideologically minded trend in high Whig politics is in power, and it isn't about free trade because it predates the repeal of the Corn Laws, but there is this powerful ideology that the reason why the poor in general, but in this context, particularly in Ireland, are hungry is because they're idle. And it's all wrong to throw charity at the undeserving poor because it will only make the situation worse. Of course, it's easy for people who are comfortably off and a long way away to subscribe to this kind of thing. And it was very definitely characteristic of Whig thinking. And it goes on up to the 1860s as a powerful element in political thinking. But in fact, the actual Irish famine crisis is relatively short. They do, in fact, ship an awful lot of food out. The Navy is involved only in that. There's also, this is a political crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's potentially a crisis of British control. And a lot of soldiers are sent out. And a lot of ships are sent out, mostly transporting supplies to villages along the coast, particularly the west coast, because that's the poorest part of Ireland.
I think that's answered my question. If we move to the actual First World War, and I had imagined that this was an opportunity. Okay, so there's obviously the major battle at Jutland, after which I don't think we see much more of the German Imperial Navy, even though the result I always thought was a draw. Is that right?
well, that's one way of looking at it, yes. From the British point of view, the result was the worst possible thing, or almost the worst possible thing. I mean, the worst possible thing would have been a real defeat, but a failure to win a crushing victory is, from the psychological point of view, very, very bad. But the Germans, of course, were in exactly the same position. They too had persuaded themselves that they were going to win a crushing victory in the first few days of the war. Um, a fortnight after the beginning of the First World War, German public opinion was already in a mood of black despair because the High Seas Fleet had failed to deliver the crushing victory, which it had always promised. The British were more realistic, that is to say, they expected a crushing victory, but they didn't necessarily expect it to happen within the first 10 days of the war. But by the time of Jutland, when the war had been going on for quite a time, they really are pretty. I mean, they're carrying on a spirit of grim determination. But when the war ends, they certainly have a victory, but it's a desperate disappointment. And it's already perfectly clear that they had made almost every possible mistake in the anti-submarine war that they could have done. And it's beginning to become clear, even in as early as 1918, that the mistakes were of, well, incompetent is not a strong enough term. Um, really gross failure to think clearly about a new problem. And the more intelligent senior officers by 1918 come out at the end of the war determined to push through a whole lot of serious reforms in essentially in the way the Navy thinks, the way it trains, the way it plans. And they do it, I have to say. It's in many ways, it's very impressive the way in which they manage to turn everything round. You compare the Second World War and the First World War, it's a commonplace that the Navy gets right in the Second World War so many things which they had disastrously failed in the First World War. But how long had elapsed between the two? 20 years. All these officers who got things right in the 1940s, anyone over the rank of captain had been trained before the First World War. So if there was things were badly wrong with the way the Navy was training itself to do things before the First World War, it's quite difficult to explain how they managed to change so radically in 20 years. Because by and large, most people, by the time they're in their mid-20s, say, are committed to their view of the world. It's quite unusual for people to change radically their way of problem solving. But actually, it seems to me the Navy did manage to change radically its way of problem solving. And that's very creditable. In fact, it's extraordinary because the Navy is it's a very monolithic organization. Well, it's a much smaller organization now, but it still definitely knows what it's doing and how to do it. The position of stray civilians who take an interest in naval affairs, telling admirals how to do things, is not a promising one, I can tell you.
If we could mention one figure who I often think, at least in sort of more general history, is overlooked during the Second World War, and who really does, I suppose, epitomize that kind of naval a sort of a key figure in the naval history of Britain rather than the Royal Navy, in Admiral Ramsay, who works
Yes.
very closely with the army at both Dunkirk and then for Operation Overlord D-Day. I mean,
Yes,
he's a hugely consequential figure, isn't he?
he's a very consequential figure, and he's an interesting figure. Um, and if he hadn't been killed at the critical moment, he would be better remembered. But one of the interesting things about Ramsay, and it's a significant factor, he retires early. And he retires early because he has money. He has no, he's inherited money. He doesn't need to grind away in tedious and unpleasant situations. If people are prepared to listen to him and give him a job, he's very happy. But when he gets to the stage where there's no obvious way forward, when he's got to, I mean, he was a, what was he? He was either rear admiral or was he vice admiral at this point? Um, it must be clear to him that he was never going to get to be first seal. And so he could probably have got a couple more jobs, but he just gets to the stage where he feels it's not worth the grind. But then, of course, the war comes, and when the war comes, everybody has something to do, and he goes off to Dover to be flag officer and finds himself running the Dunkirk evacuation, which naturally had not been in the plans. And he's brilliant at it. And after that, people don't forget him.
If we look at post-war, I was reading. It was interesting. That seemed that the Royal Navy was quite impressive in some innovations, such as I was reading about the raised angled deck
Oh
that
yeah,
during the 1950s, which is hugely influential on aircraft carriers post-war.
it also has a big impact on Anglo-American relations because actually the British did a lot to save the US Navy in a situation. Everybody thinks the US Navy came out of the Second World War ruling the world. That was what the US Navy thought, but not for long. Because when they came back from the Pacific, they discovered that in their absence, the new US Air Force had taken over the world. Because the official interpretation in Washington, the only interpretation in Washington for some time, was that nuclear weapons ruled the world. We have nuclear weapons. We have won everything. Nothing else is necessary. And certainly not more ships. And the nuclear weapons were bombs, which weighed 4 or 5 tons each and could only be carried by specially adapted 4-engine bombers. There was no question of the US Navy's new carrier force, and it was new. They were all brand new ships carrying nuclear weapons. So suddenly the US Navy, having, as they supposed, won the Pacific War, which was the only thing that mattered, single-handed, suddenly discovers that the rug has been pulled out from under them in the biggest possible way. And it must have been an appalling shock for them, because they really did come home from the Pacific expecting to be greeted by cheering crowds and ticker tape. And there's nobody on the quayside, apart from a few wives, even to greet them. And back in Washington, the Air Force are loudly proclaiming that they rule the world. Well, they really were. I mean, they'd got this brand new carrier fleet built during the Second World War. They'd lost almost all the small number of carriers they had at the beginning of the war. So they built a big fleet, eventually 16, 18 on fleet carriers. But they're all useless because they can't carry atomic weapons. If atomic weapons are the only thing which matter, they're no good at all. And it's really a ghastly blow for them. And it's a ghastly blow to a minor degree for the British, but the British actually, well, they're not a satisfied power. They're definitely an unsatisfied power. Also, they the the Royal Navy has access to air research establishments. The US Navy has none because it's not occurred to them that there could be any improvement on the aircraft and the aircraft carriers they have. They are perfect. We are perfect. There is nobody else in the world but us. We don't need to think about change. Nobody needs to change when they're perfect. And then suddenly the British come along and say, actually, there are two things that we've been playing with, which you might be interested in. And the angled deck, the steam catapult, the mirror landing site are a kind of complete system which makes it possible to fly jet aircraft. Because the real problem is jets. Because you understand, all the naval aircraft of the Second World War are propeller driven. Propeller driven aircraft generate maximum thrust at rest. Then the faster you go, the smaller the amount of marginal thrust. You can fly off quite a short flight deck with propeller driven aircraft. But jets operate in precisely the opposite way. A stationary jet generates hardly any thrust. The faster you go, the better the thrust. So if you're going to fly off a long, long concrete runway, it's wonderful. But a short flight deck, it is not wonderful at all. In fact, it's completely hopeless. And the steam catapult is one component of the answer to this. The angled deck makes it possible for aircraft to land and run on if they fail to hook the wire. Whereas if you have a straight down the flight deck line and they run on, they run straight into the back of the aircraft waiting to be catapulted off and generate a massive disaster. And the other thing is, you must have seen pictures of wartime aircraft carriers. The batsman guides the aircraft in.
Yes.
He waves his baton, and what he's doing is getting them to come in on exactly the right approach, not too high, not too fast, because if you misjudge that, you are in big trouble and you've got to get it absolutely right. But the jets are too fast. They can't fly slowly. Nobody can judge the situation fast enough to land a jet and pick up a wire. But the mirror landing site gives the pilot, it's basically a big mirror in the back of the island with a powerful light being shone into it. And you adjust the angle of the light so that depending on what aircraft you've got, all depends on how fast the aircraft is coming in. Different aircraft need different ratings. But you come in and you watch the light reflected in the mirror, and it has some lights on either side, which mean go up, go down, go left, go right, and you follow your instructions and you get guided in. And it sounds horrifying, and indeed they were horrified to begin with, but it does actually work. And it basically saved the carrier as a working instrument of naval power, which has kept the US Navy afloat from that day to this.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Well, there is and this might be unfair asking a historian, because if we come up to the contemporary period, we have, these aircraft carriers now, nuclear air carriers that cost, billions and billions and billions. And the US and the British and now the Australians have this pact, which seems to be to provide defensive operations around Taiwan, with China looking hungrily at Taiwan. But these very expensive carriers can now be destroyed by these new carrier killer missiles. And so are we now at another stage of, with navies now becoming rather vulnerable to relatively inexpensive weaponry?
Well, maybe, but it's always been the case ever since, well, certainly ever since modern weapons started coming in, certainly ever since the 19th century, that somebody comes along with a new, exciting weapon, which is going to win every battle and solve every problem. The historical commonplace has been that they tend never to work quite as well as their manufacturers claim. And these Chinese anti-carrier missiles may work, but there are some quite considerable problems. I mean, they're basically ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles go up, they go 200, 250 miles up, they come down vertically, and they go bang, having struck the target. If the target is stationary, as cities are, this is a plausible line. If the target is moving, it's all a bit trickier. In fact, it's extremely tricky because the target, a moving target, I mean, carriers look awfully big, but from the perspective of a missile traveling at immensely high speed from up in the upper atmosphere, where is the carrier? How do you know where the carrier is? If you've got the carrier under actual real-time surveillance by, for example, a reconnaissance aircraft, and if you've got really good communications with a missile which is traveling at prodigiously high speed, then it might work. But those are quite a lot of ifs. And we will never know until we engage in a war of this kind, which I rather hope we won't have to do. It may be true. The carrier killers may work. And the carriers, of course, are not numerous. But it's, well, wonderful new weapons are to a penny. And sometimes they work, but not necessarily as well as their proponents claim.
Okay, well,
Not
I'm going
easy.
to take that as a note of optimism with which to end it. But I just have one final question for you, and it is going to take us right back to the 18th century and early 19th and your previous book. So please indulge me. If we take Nelson as a 5 out of 5 admiral, unsurpassed, where would you place, and I might be being unfair, but Admiral Byng at 0, where would you place Admiral Hood, the first Viscount Samuel Hood?
Oh, that's interesting. He's a talented man. I suppose I'd really need to, if I was really treating this as a serious exam, I'd want to go back and read his papers again.
But if I put a gun to your head,
Nelson was not perfect. Nelson does
it's disappointing to hear.
he makes a number of mistakes, but he was in an age when most admirals were imperfect. Nelson really arouses the undying enthusiasm of other officers and ordinary sailors who'd never met him. There are wonderful sailors' letters written after Trafalgar, where I remember the one that says, men who'd never seen the admiral swearing and crying, and he had a tremendous emotional hold on the Navy. And that's really the basis of his the sort of Nelson cult. The Nelson cult is really built up after in the mid to late 19th century, it reaches its peak when there's nobody left who can remember Nelson, because the people who could remember him were a bit equivocal about him. And the more that the Navy became respectable, the more difficult it became to make Nelson the patron saint of the Navy. So it's really in the end of the 19th century that pressure groups, naval pressure groups, decide on Trafalgar and Nelson as their kind of centerpiece. And then every other navy tries to do the same. The British have shown this is how you've got to do it. So we too have got to have a national admiral and national victory. Some of the navies find this extremely difficult to achieve. I mean, the US Navy, to take a conspicuous example, has only a very short history and only a very small number of even moderately glorious victories, and finds the whole thing very embarrassing. You mustn't say that to them. I forbid you to quote that. But they all try and achieve this. The French try and achieve it. The Germans try and achieve it. And so
Do the Americans do it with the who's that white-haired admiral from Midway? Remind me, I've forgotten his name.
Midway. Now, Midway is actually one of the most embarrassing episodes in the entire whole of American history, because the entire official account of Midway until very recently was totally fictitious. It depended entirely on the fact that a man called Mitchell cooked the records, made a report of proceedings which was completely fictitious. And only fairly recently that this has come out, and they're not keen to talking about it now. I mean, they did succeed in sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and that was an unequivocal victory, but it was also a total accident. They had no idea where they were. They had no idea where the Japanese were. By pure accident, they ran into the Japanese carriers just as they were flying off their airstrike. Most of the US carrier aircraft had already been lost at this point because they'd all flown off at random in the wrong direction. They'd all disobeyed orders. They were all drowned, basically. But just the only group of them that actually stayed together were the dive bombers. At least quite a lot of them stayed together. And the dive bombers, well, they didn't stay together because they divided into 2 different groups and flew in different directions. But then by the merest accident, they converged, sighted one another, and at the same moment, they sighted the Japanese carriers. But it wasn't brilliant planning. It wasn't planning at all. It was 10,000 to 1 chance. Well, of course, it's not what admirals report in their reports of proceedings, and it certainly wasn't in this case. And for 30 or 40 years, they managed to keep it all up. But eventually, there were too many people who had seen too much, and it all began to leak out. So Midway was a really important battle, all right, really important victory, but exactly who you give the credit for and what credit you give them is another matter.
Fascinating. And can you've avoided the Hood question.
I think Hood was a good man, but I also think that most of the 18th century admirals, there are things you can say to their discredit, and that's partly because they really had no very advanced sort of professional doctrine about handling ships and fleets. There are people who are interested in tactics and so on, but the typical admiral knew very little about it. It's very uncommon for people to command in an action at sea who've ever fought in one before, because they don't happen very often. So you find yourself dealing with an immensely complex problem about which you have almost no practical experience. Just now and again, you get somebody who fights in several successive battles, and some of them actually get better as they go on. But a lot of them never fought in a battle at all, or if they did fight in one, it might be their only experience. So they got better. In many ways, they were much better at training, much better at learning. They were doing better. If you look at what's going on in the Second World War, they're very clever, I think, and very determined at training. And I'm particularly fascinated by some of the methods of training which we developed during the Second World War. Wonderful. Well, there is a description in the books. I won't say too much.
Yeah.
The way that they trained submarine captains with it was called the submarine attack teacher. That's what it was. Model train carrying model ships, and the trainee submarine captains looking through, as it were, model periscope. It sounds like almost a child's toy. In a certain sense, it was a miniature, but it was very, very intelligently done, and it really worked. And it's also really interesting to see that this is the point where women are making a critical contribution, which is fairly new in the Second World War. There are some examples in the First World War, but not much before that. And I happen to be very interested in that.
Yes, now have a huge role to play in the Navy.
Yes. Well, now, of course, they've joined the Navy.
Yeah.
The really interesting thing that when I'm looking at, it's the Wrens, who were a separate service. They weren't they existed to work with the Navy, but they weren't part of it. And in some respects, I think that's the key to their success.
Interesting.
That they were actually semi-independent.
This has been just fantastic. And I've overrun. I've taken up more of your time, so I do apologize. But this has been absolutely brilliant. I've loved chatting to you about this fascinating period of British history. But thank you. You
realize I'm talking off the top of my head. I do not positively guarantee not to have made any mistakes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you. This is an interesting experience. Perhaps this is the new way, but old fogies like me, bred up in the pre-computer age, it's all quite exciting. Oh, good. Well, the whole it's just one way of trying to entice people to buy books, really. If you chat about the subject matter, you hope they're interested enough, and our statistics seem to suggest they are. To buy books. Yeah, exactly. But there aren't enough people buying books, I don't think. So any methods to try and encourage them to do. There can never be enough people buying books. That's to say, the more the better. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you, and best of luck with it. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for listening. Links are in the show notes, and coming up on Saturday, it's the writer William Boyd on espionage and his new spy novel. But until then, thank you and good night.